This is a podcast based on my experience travelling through Europe, following Patrick Leigh Fermor's journey from the Hook of Holland to Istanbul in 1933. I joined the route from Munich to Budapest along a small section. With me today, I have called through séance Patrick Leigh Fermor immediately after he wrote his book, Through the Power of Imagination. And he's going to read a little excerpt from his experience as he arrived in Munich.
Nipping and eager, the air bites shrewdly, and the snow of the winds have obliterated all the details of the journey to Munich. The snow is still falling hard when the scene clears in the late afternoon. At the post restant counter of the Hauptpost, they handed over a registered envelope crossed with blue chalk. Inside, stiff and new, were £4 notes. Just in time. In high spirits, I headed for the Jugendherberge, one of the very few youth hostels that still survived, where the magic word student secured me a bed in a long empty dormitory.
In Munich, for my experience at the hostel, I had a somewhat similar thing happen to me, where I got kicked out of my bed. So they didn't post up in the one immediately beside me. They posted up and said I was in their spot. It was a Romanian gentleman, around 40, didn't speak any English, and he was like, my bed. And I didn't really want to argue with a big heavy man for the spot in the bed, but there was no sign that it was his, really. It just looked pretty messy, and there's 500 open beds in the room, but I wasn't going to fight over that, so I gave up my spot and went out to try and have a look around Munich, but I was pretty tired after coming in on the plane, so that was my immediate experience. When I first arrived in Munich, getting off the plane, I got stared at from a lady behind the counter for the EU arrivals, and she looked disdainful of all the British arrivals as we stood in the queue for about 2 hours waiting to get through to the people, as we were with all the internationals following Brexit. She stood there and all the British people were complaining and grumbling under their breath about the way we were being treated, but I suppose we brought that on ourselves, and she seemed to be getting some form of enjoyment out of observing all of us complain about what we've done when we've made our bed for ourselves in Brexit. After my experience getting off the plane in Munich, I received my box, thankfully, but then spent about 2 hours outside trying to find a spot to sit down and reassemble the bike out of the box, which I did. It all went kind of smoothly. There's a couple of families giving an inquisitive look, and I managed to find a skip, thankfully, to dump my box into afterwards, and the bike seemed sturdy enough, and then I decided I think I would go all the way to Munich, which was a bit of a mistake. At 7 o'clock at night from the airport, I decided I'd try and cycle it to test it out, which I regretted afterwards. Having regretted my cycle and ambitious plan for the first day, and having stayed at the hostel and getting kicked out of my bed, things were looking up. I continued on up to Landshut, which was my first 40-kilometre day. It went okay. I was needing a poo for a big portion of the first section, so was suffering to try and find my way to a public toilet as I cycled past the airport for a second time on the way north and east. I continued on and found myself on to the next day, having a good time in Landshut, and then moving on and cycling, following more of the Isar River out to the east.
There was something meditative and consoling about this dim season, except towards evening, when the sun, invisible through the clouds, reduced to a silvery blur, or expanded to an orange globe like a winter cherry, began to set. Then brooks fell silent. The pink afterglow faded on faraway peaks. The light dwindled over the grey fields, and life ebbed with a shudder, like a soul leaving the body. All was suddenly quiet and ghostly, and I longed for the first glimpse of the lamplight streaming through the window of my destined village.
I've got another chance. The things you've made
So I experienced quite a few nice sunsets, and the weather was a lot easier for my trip, it being summer and bright sunshine from pretty much 5 in the morning till 11 o'clock at night. This was pleasant, but also meant that waking up in the morning each day ended up being a very early start for my standards. So I felt pretty exhausted by the third or fourth day, getting up at 6 a.m. Additionally, the sunsets were amazing across the open fields and alongside the river as I travelled down to the east, over to Passau at the border between Germany and Austria.
Heading in the twilight for one of these 3 uncharted villages, I had a moment of panic. I was long past the last signpost that had pointed to Pfaffenbachel and Marvang. I remember these 2 names because the first was ridiculous and the second rather sinister. All at once, it was dark and the snow was coming down fast. I was feeling my way by a wooden rail when I lost touch and fell stumbling in a drift and floundered in circles but couldn't find the rail. I must have strayed into a field. Luckily, I found a ruined barn and fumbled my way to the door.
He then went on to clear the snow out of the way and fell asleep within the barn. I had a similar experience travelling past Efferding up to the Ince, and there's a lightning storm, so I could see, so it wasn't quite so dire the situation, but I took cover in a barn with a pig which was going absolutely crazy, squealing because of the lightning, so I had a very uneasy rest in that barn at around 9 o'clock at night. Patrick Leigh Fermor said the name of Marvang was sinister. My name of the barn where I was staying was outside Fuckersburg, which is a bit less sinister, more humorous. But equally, it wasn't pleasant staying with the squealing pig. Riding along to Osterhofen from Landau, the sun was setting. It was quite a pleasant journey. I made it up off of the Iso River, up a small hill, which felt like a big hill because my bike was quite heavy. I was riding through these little small villages to get to Osterhofen, and as the sun was setting, I came across quite a few war memorials for German soldiers for both World War One and World War Two, and it struck me as quite surprising, but also it made sense that there was war memorials for World War Two. On the monuments there were dioramas of soldiers being wounded and collapsing with the steel helm and iron crosses. Later, after his trip through Europe in 1933, Patrick Leigh Fermor put some of his skills to use in World War II when he was a British officer fighting in Crete, and they managed to capture an enemy German officer before evacuating by boat from the island of Crete. This was later made into a film in 1957 called Ill Met by Moonlight, which is worth a watch if you're into historical accounts of the war. I enjoyed it.
Appalling things had happened since Hitler had come into power 10 months earlier, but the range of horrors was not yet fully unfolded. In the country, the prevailing mood was of a bewildered acquiescence. Occasionally it rose to fanaticism. Often, when nobody was in earshot, it found utterance in pessimism, distrust and foreboding, and sometimes in shame and fear, but only in private. The rumours of the concentration camps were still no louder than a murmur, but they hinted at countless unavowable tragedies. In one of those lost Rhineland towns, I can't remember which, I had a glimpse of how quick the changeover had been for many Germans. In a workman's bar late at night, I made friends with several factory hands in overalls who had come off a late shift. They were about my age, and one of them, an amusing clownish character, said, "Why didn't I dust down on his brother's camp bed at his place?" When we climbed the ladder to the attic, the room turned out to be a shrine of Hitlerianer. The walls were covered with flags, photographs, posters, slogans and emblems. His SA uniform hung neatly ironed on a hanger. He explained these cult objects with fetishist zest, saving up till the last, the centrepiece of his collection. It was an automatic pistol, a Luger Parabellum, I think carefully oiled and wrapped in mackintosh. accompanied by a pile of green cardboard boxes packed with bullets. He stripped and reassembled a pistol, loaded the magazine and smacked it home and ejected it again, put on a belt and cross brace with a holster, whipped the gun in and out like a cowboy, tossed it in the air and caught it, spun it round by the trigger guard and danced about with one eye shut, going through the motions of aiming and firing with loud clicks of the tongue.
I myself went to a German flat party in Passau. There's a lot of that stuff is behind and sometimes recognised in jokes, but is still taken quite seriously because it's illegal to make any salutes of that sort anymore. Although under the modern student population, people are getting more comfortable with the advent of the internet and data spreading everywhere, that whilst it is illegal and people are strongly against it, it's less raw in the memory of people in their early 20s. Today, it's understood that if you're talking about fascism, it's in a joking context.
When I said that it must be rather claustrophobic with all that stuff on the walls, he laughed and sat down on his bed and said, "Bitch, you should have seen it last year. You would have laughed. Then it was all red flags, stars, hammers and sickles, pictures of Lenin and Stalin, and workers of the world unite. I used to punch the heads of anyone singing the Horst Wessel Lied. It was all the red flag and the international then. I wasn't only a sosie, but a commie, ein echter Bolshevik." He gave a clenched fist salute. "You should have seen me. Street fights. We used to beat the hell out of the Nazis, and they beat the hell out of us. We laughed ourselves silly. Man hat sich totgelacht. Then suddenly, when Hitler came into power, I understood it was all nonsense and lies. I realised Adolf was the man for me. All of a sudden, he snapped his fingers in the air, and here I am." "What about all his old pals?" I asked. "They changed too. All those chaps in the bar, every single one. They're all in the SA now. Had a lot of people done the same then?" "A lot." His eyes opened wide. "Millions, I tell you. I was astonished how easily they all changed sides." He shook his head dubiously for a moment, then a wide and troubled smile divided his face as he spilled the bullets like a rosary through his fingers of one hand into the palm of the other.
I met a man called Nico who was also bikepacking from Bosnia and Herzegovina, and I met him in Emmersdorf as we were travelling along the Danube. And he told me about his time in the wars in Yugoslavia in the 90s. He said back in the day he used to hate the Serbian people, but today he's got many of them who he considers friends. So that's only 20 years after the war, but it does change. What Patrick Leigh Fermor was referring to there was how people also can change sides in maybe a not so productive way. So it's quite human to be influenceable and more influenceable than we first might consider. I continued my travels along and found my way to Vienna after that, and we will continue the story from Vienna next time.